From the Columbia University Language Resource Center, this is Said and Done, the podcast about languages and the people who speak them. This is Said and Done. I'm Chris Kaiser, and joining me today is Richard R., whom I've gotten to know as a student of classical Tibetan here at Columbia. Richard, who has preferred not to share his last name, talks with me in this conversation about his journey to and within Tibetan Buddhism and the central role that the Tibetan language has played in his religious practice and in his life over the past several decades. Here's my conversation with Richard R. Richard, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you for having me.
You are a graduate of Columbia College. You are a student of Tibetan language and literature, as well as a Buddhist practitioner. You are an authorized Lama in the Kagyu and Nyingma lineages of Tibetan Buddhism. And today, we're going to talk about Tibetan Buddhism, your journey and experiences with that practice, as well as your encounter with the Tibetan language. So, to start, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how you first came to an awareness of Tibetan Buddhism and the beginning of your journey with that practice.
I guess that would start when I was a young person, and even before college, I was very much interested in finding the truth. Now, I can't exactly define even now what the truth is, but I certainly didn't know what it was then. So I had this real drive to find the truth. And I was interested in literature, and I was particularly interested in the Greek and Latin classics. So when I entered Columbia College, I majored in Greek and Latin because my idea was the best way to find the truth is to go into the language behind the words and find what they're talking about. And I was very aware that the English language was full of Greek and Latin derivatives and borrowed words. And I thought, well, I should go back to Greek and back to Latin and dig in and find out what the truth of these words really is. This was my motivation. And so at Columbia College, I studied Greek and Latin and English literature as well. During that time, my quest for truth was not yet satisfied. But somewhere along the way, when I got to graduate school at the University of Pennsylvania, where I studied Sanskrit and linguistics generally, still looking for the truth, because I thought, well, Sanskrit's even farther back. And that led me to something called Proto-Indo-European, which is the original source for all these languages. So that was very fascinating. And then I came back to New York City, and I went to a poetry reading by Allen Ginsberg, very famous poet.
Wow.
I'm sure you've heard of Allen Ginsberg.
Yes.
And he said that he would be teaching poetry out in Colorado somewhere that coming summer. And I thought, what a great thing. I'll go to Colorado. I'm tired of New York City. Let's go to Colorado and live in the mountains. So meanwhile, I had not heard of Buddhism yet. I was just still looking for the truth. So I went out to study poetry with Allen Ginsberg out there at Naropa University. And while I was there, I noticed that something was going on, and people were walking around with red strings around their neck, and they were talking about, oh, have you heard about du-du-du-du-du-du-du? It was somebody's Tibetan name, but I couldn't understand what it was. And then I've heard some talk about meditation, and somebody mentioned the Buddha, and I got intrigued. So I thought, well, I should go to listen to one of the talks by one of these Buddhist teachers. So I borrowed a card, and I needed a pass. I borrowed it, and then I went to this class, and there was this guy talking about Tibetan Buddhism, and it was brilliant and captivating. And I walked out of that first talk, and I thought, finally, somebody is saying the truth. Ooh, the truth. That's what I was looking for the whole time, right? I'd been going to school for years not hearing the truth. And then this guy got up there, and for 45 minutes, in my perception at that time, he was telling the truth.
Yeah.
So I immediately thought, this is for me. And 2 weeks later, I took refuge in a ceremony that you sort of proclaim yourself as entering the Buddhist path. And it went from there. And then shortly after that, I met a Tibetan teacher who came from Tibet and was teaching in the West, and he was the one who they were talking about, whose name I couldn't.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I couldn't catch what
Yeah.
they were saying because it was in Tibetan.
And by the way, where is Naropa
Oh,
University?
sorry, it's in Boulder, Colorado.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
And the teacher's name was Chogyam Trungpa. And many people listening to this may have heard of him. So I was captivated by him, and then I have pretty much followed it ever since. And I've gone through long retreats, long teaching seminars, many other teachers, on and on and on. However, there was one missing factor.
Mm-hmm.
The missing factor was the Tibetan language.
Yeah.
And all the teachings are in Tibetan originally, obviously.
Yeah.
And I was doing many kinds of practices relying on English translations. Well, English translations are helpful to kind of point the way, but for the most part, those English translations are somebody else's idea of what the teaching is saying.
Mm-hmm.
So that was not enough for me, so I had to learn Tibetan. And so then a few years later, I went back to Naropa and took the master's degree in basically Tibetan language and Tibetan philosophy. My reasoning for that was the same as it was when I was a little kid, or when I was just about entering college. It was to get to the truth. And I knew that language was the only way to get at least to the point where I could then find the truth. Not that the language itself is the truth per se. It's not, but it's pointing to the truth that doesn't have any language.
So it's more a pathway.
It's a vehicle or a pathway to get past ignorance and get into the truth that I was looking for. And that you find in the meditation. So the language leads into the meditation.
So I have a number of questions at this point.
Well, sure.
And I think I'll start with a very simple and almost just pure curiosity. What was it like being, in contact with this famous figure, Allen Ginsberg? What was your take on him personally, or what was it like to be in his orbit?
Yeah, he was very inspiring and very poetically brilliant, but I wasn't hearing the truth from him. He was a stepping stone. He was my first stepping stone moving towards finding this truth that I've been trying for all this time.
Yeah.
He didn't have it.
Okay.
He was good at poetry and he was a wonderful person.
Yeah.
But he was the one that got me to go to Naropa in Boulder, Colorado. And once I was there, then I met the Buddhists.
Okay. The other, I guess the second and more serious question that I have is for anybody who might not know, and I include myself, what are some of the features or aspects or ideas that when you encountered them in Naropa, as you were learning initially about Buddhism, what kind of stood out to you, or what were you thinking? Can you just kind of paint a very basic picture for people who don't really have a familiarity with this?
Well, I think, that's a good question. I mean, it could be answered in many, many ways, but I think the primary point is that basically we are not happy. We are not satisfied. We are frustrated, and we want to be happy. We want to be relaxed. We want to be fulfilled, and we try everything. Mm-hmm. Nothing really works. In the deepest sense, nothing really works. There are temporary pleasures and temporary satisfactions, you might say, but under it all, we are not happy, not satisfied. Everything is always not quite right. There's always something missing.
Yeah.
Everyone feels this.
Yeah.
Buddhism has an answer. It's called Buddha nature.
And what
Buddha nature
is that?
Is the truth that I've been, this same theme from the very beginning of what I'm saying. Buddha nature is one word for it. There are other words. Buddha nature is this truth that I had been seeking and striving for all these years through all of the education and everything. And what is Buddha nature? Well, it is the enlightenment that is within everyone. Now, this opens up questions of religion and other traditions and so forth. Some would say it's God. Some would say it's some other kind of expression of something. But Buddhism says it in a very, very unconditional and non-conceptual way. We are enlightened Buddhas, all of us, but we don't know it. The task or the mission of Buddhism is to wake that up and make us truly realize it, truly experience it, and really recognize it, then all of a sudden, although not all of a sudden, it takes years, but at some point, you get it.
Uh-huh.
And then all the difficulties, they don't disappear, but they're not difficult. All the pain doesn't disappear, but it doesn't hurt. All the frustration doesn't disappear, but it doesn't bring frustration, right? The world remains as horrible as it is, but it isn't a problem. And this is, I'm speaking in a very kind of elevated way, but this is something that a person entering into Buddhism will cultivate over a long period of time.
And is that the idea that attracted you and brought you into the practice?
Well, the idea didn't attract me because I didn't know this idea. I had never heard it. I saw it in the teacher.
Okay.
I saw this is, and several teachers, these are people who are not frustrated. These are people who are not in kind of confusion and painful disturbance. These are people who are sitting there calmly, clearly, intelligently, in a relaxed way, with poise and dignity. What more do you want?
Have you, over the time that you've been practicing Buddhism and teaching it as well, has this state that you saw in these teachers, is that something that you have experienced? And if so, is it something that you experience as a kind of binary, like on or off, like a switch, or is it more of a continuum
of experience?
Yeah,
good question. It's beyond on and off. On and off has nothing to do with it.
Okay.
That's what I'm trying to say. The world is as bad as it ever was.
Mm.
That isn't the issue. The issue is how do you relate to it?
Mm-hmm.
How do you help others? The purpose of Buddhism is realizing the true nature and then helping others to wake up to their Buddha nature and not live in a confused and painful daily grind, kind of like that.
Yeah.
So I'm not sure what was the question exactly, but
whether it was you're either in it or you're out of it, or you're in it partially and you learn get more.
First you're totally out of it.
Yeah.
Then you're in it and out of it, in it and out of it, and then finally you're in it.
Okay. So this practice is something that people do today in our modern world, but it's rooted in a specific time and place.
It started in India about 2,500 years ago. And this was even before, this is an interesting aspect, even before I even heard of Buddhism. I mean, I almost think I never even heard of it. I decided to study Sanskrit, still being drawn to what I feel is the back to the truth. All the Buddhist scriptures are written originally in Sanskrit. I wasn't thinking that at the time, but my karma, if I may bring that into it, my karma was heading me all the time towards this.
And karma means fate or
karma means
destiny?
It doesn't mean fate exactly. It means the causes and conditions that I bring to this life enable me to encounter things like Sanskrit, things like Buddhism, so forth.
Can you talk a little bit more about how Buddhism moves from being written in Sanskrit, being rooted in India 2,500 years ago, and how does it, what is the Tibetan piece to this?
Yeah, excellent question. It started in India, and then around maybe 1,000 Common Era, I'm not sure exactly the timing, maybe somewhere around 800 or 1,000.
Okay.
Buddhism, for certain reasons, began to diminish in India. And many of the teachers went north to Tibet, partly because they felt like they had to go somewhere where they could propagate the teachings, and partly because they were invited. The Tibetans had heard that this was going on in India. And many Tibetans climbed over, literally walked over the Himalayas. They didn't have helicopters. They walked. They walked at the risk of their life to India to get these teachings. And they learned Sanskrit before they went, and they collected texts, Sanskrit texts, mostly Sanskrit.
Yeah.
A few in Pali, but basically Sanskrit. They collected many, many texts. They met many, many gurus and lamas, received many, many teachings, and they brought the whole thing north. They carried it on their backs, walking over the Himalayas, right?
Yeah.
At the risk of their lives, literally, and brought it into Tibet in that way. And then the first and most important project that was undertaken in Tibet was to translate. And they translated everything into Tibetan. Every scrap of Sanskrit that they could find, they translated into Tibetan. And these are now preserved in huge collections that actually Columbia has most of it.
Oh, really?
Yeah, we have here at Columbia, we have most of the canonical texts in Tibetan.
Oh, wow. Oh, I didn't realize that.
Yeah, so the source was Sanskrit. It was brought later to Tibet, and everything was translated. So for the next, since around 1,000 or so, or 800 or 900 or 1,000, up to today, they've been practicing and studying and teaching all of this in Tibetan. This is why I wanted to learn. I spent more time later on Sanskrit because it's very helpful to know where the Tibetan translators got their material. They got it from Sanskrit. So you can compare, and I've done much of this, you can compare the Sanskrit text, you put that here, and you put the Tibetan text here, and you see how they did it. It's extremely illuminating to see how they took that Sanskrit and brought it into Tibetan. These were not literal translations at the beginning. These were meaning translations. They were translating what it really means based on their having learned it from lamas and having meditated in caves for years. They translated that way in the first wave of translating from Sanskrit. Yeah. And then later there was a second wave in Tibet where they created what they called word translations, literally looking everything up in the dictionary and just word by word. And those are called word translations in the later schools. The school that I follow are the meaning translations because I'm looking for the truth. I'm not looking for a perfect translation.
So as we think about meaning translations and word translations.
This is a key point.
So you've expressed that you see language as a vehicle for delivering or moving towards the truth.
Getting to the meaning.
Getting to the meaning.
Truth, meaning, kind of same thing.
And so what is your take on the value or utility of meaning translations versus word translations when we're talking about Sanskrit texts being then translated into Tibetan?
Yes. First, you have to learn the words. Then you have to discover the meaning. This is exactly what it is.
But could it not be that when Tibetans are translating these Sanskrit texts, which at that time were probably very old, or could have been
pretty old, yeah.
Are they imposing the meanings of their time and their environment and their concerns on texts that had other concerns to which they did not have access? Right.
That, of course, would be a possibility, but the nature of these texts is such that cultural accumulations are irrelevant. They're talking about something which is universal and applicable everywhere, regardless of culture, regardless of whatever kind of bias there may be or whatever's going on
in any time.
I mean, it's like a scientific paper. It's the same in China or in the U.S., right?
So if I were to go to the collections of that Columbia has of these texts, what are some of the texts about? What's the content of the texts?
Yeah, there's a very large range, but I guess in a way to just sort of bring it to the main point, Buddhism is teaching emptiness and it's teaching Buddha nature. Emptiness means things are not truly real, not truly existent. Everything is impermanent. Everything is arising due to causes and conditions. As I was saying earlier, the causes and conditions that brought me to Buddhism, just causes and conditions. So emptiness is important, and then Buddha nature means we have this enlightened awareness. We are awake and alive and aware, and that's what it's teaching. And then traditionally it's said that there are 84,000 teachings of the Buddha.
Oh, okay.
That's what they say, 84,000 teachings. What they mean is that it's vast and inexhaustible. The reasoning is because beings who need teachings, beings who need help are infinite and vast. So there's something for everyone. Some people are stuck in one way, people are stuck in another way. Whatever you need, somewhere in the Buddhist scriptures and in the Buddhist teachings, you will find it.
You told me at the beginning, before our conversation, that you're a lama in these two traditions, in the Kagyu and the Nyingma traditions. So what as a Lama, what is your role? What is your
To
responsibility?
teach.
And how do you?
I'm teaching you now.
You are. You are. You are. And do you teach? How do you teach? How do you know
Well,
what to teach?
Oh, how do I know what to teach?
Yeah.
Well, basically, there are two methods of teaching, and this is also traditional. You teach what has been taught to you, and you teach what you have experienced. And actually, you teach both.
Uh-huh.
So I was taught by my teachers certain things. I went into meditations, retreats, very long, 3-4 year retreats.
Wow.
And coming out of that, I have experience.
Mm-hmm.
So when I come out and teach something, I'm teaching the words that I heard. I'm teaching the language from the teachers, and I'm teaching the truth from my experience. So this is the intersection of language and truth. Going back again to my first days at Columbia College, I was looking for truth, and I started with language.
Yeah. Yeah.
So by the end of it, here I am today. Now I know what the relationship is between language and truth. The truth is not in the language, but the language gets you there.
Yeah. Can you talk about your most recent study of classical Tibetan, which you're doing here at Columbia in the Language Resource Center? What are you seeing? What are you working on? And what perspective do you have on this language study, given this voluminous life experience?
That's an interesting question as well. I have to confess, and this is my disclosure, is I'm not really good at language. This is the beauty of it, really, is I'm not even good at languages. I mean, I have to look everything up over and over again. I look up a word, and then 10 minutes later, I don't remember it, and I have to look it up again. You can ask Sonam about this.
Yeah, yeah.
But the point is that because the language is so essential to get to the meaning, I'm trying to refine and hone my language skills, not for their own sake, but to further get to this meaning and truth that's embedded in there, or that they're pointing to. So if my grammar is bad and I'm careless about the meanings of Tibetan words, that's not helpful.
Uh-huh. Can we talk about maybe an example of a word or a concept, and just sort of telescope it through the different languages that you know it in, maybe English, and how it's different in Sanskrit and how it's different in Tibetan?
I could just give a sort of a brief example. There, in English, we have a word for space.
Uh-huh.
So I say space, and then you have some idea of what that means. Some people think space is like outer space, or some people think of give me some space, Well, in Sanskrit, it's a dhatu, D-H-A-T-U. That kind of means like a place or a functioning realm, something like that. And then in Tibetan, there are quite a few words for it, different kinds of ways of saying it, but dhatu is usually translated as ying. Mm-hmm. And then in Tibetan, that's spelled D-B-Y-I-N-G-S.
Oh,
pronounce ying. By the way, in parentheses, the first thing that really is difficult with Tibetan is you can't figure out how to pronounce the words. Mm-hmm. But anyway, so it goes from dhatu to ying, and then so English translators really only have kind of one word for it. But that one word doesn't point to all of the meaningful connotations of ying. Ying is not just look up in the sky and you don't see anything. It's just empty space. It doesn't mean empty space. Space in English implies empty.
It does, yeah.
Right, empty of anything. But ying is something which is luminous and full, right? And in Sanskrit, dhatu is like a realm.
Right, yeah.
Right. So
with all kinds of things in it. Yeah.
With enlightenment in it. That's the point.
And what is ying then?
It's same. Okay. Basically, it doesn't change much from the in that way from Sanskrit to Tibetan. Now there's another example which might be helpful. The name of the Buddha, or the word for Buddha in Sanskrit, is Buddha, and that is translated into Tibetan as Sanjay. Sanjay.
Okay.
So that's not a literal translation at all. That's a meaning translation. Buddha means, in Sanskrit, it means awakened one or something like that.
Yeah.
Buddha is kind of like awakened mind. Sanjay means purified and expanded. So sang means made pure, purified, and Jie means spread widely, expanded, blossoming. Well, that's a very beautiful translation of a boring word.
Yeah.
I mean,
What?
an enlightened person or Buddha, enlightened mind doesn't say anything, but purified of confusion and blossoming with wisdom is very, very beautiful. And Tibetan translators did this all across the literature. In the first meaning translation spread of the Dharma, in the second later spread, they kind of pulled that back and they made it more literal and less poetic and less meaningful.
But you lose some of that meaning.
You lose a lot. You lose almost everything.
and as you describe it, not only do you lose the meaning there, but maybe you lose the referent of the meaning, the thing that the meaning is pointing to.
You lose what you...
Or that the word is pointing to.
Yeah, you lose what it is intended to point to. None of these words in any of the languages are the meaning itself. But you need words with enough to point to the meaning that they're trying to get to. So purified and blossoming or blooming, that points to much more wisdom than awakened awareness. Well, I mean, awakened awareness is great, but it doesn't evoke anything.
Well, awakened could just be somebody woke you up after you were sleeping.
It could be just you're responding to your alarm clock in the morning.
Yeah.
But purified of confusion and blossoming with wisdom is much more evocative of what really means.
You use the word dharma. Mm-hmm. What does that mean?
Dharma is Dharma in Sanskrit, and it's Chö in Tibetan, Chos, Chö. It just means that's the body of teachings.
Ah, okay.
Yeah.
When you look at the body of teachings, and you're looking at it in these different languages, in English, in Sanskrit, and in Tibetan Buddhism, are there particular texts that you find most compelling or that you sort of rely upon in your teaching? Or is it kind of, you'll go anywhere with the...
It's all good.
Okay.
You can't go wrong. It depends on the needs of the students, entirely the needs of the students and what's appropriate for them. A Lama does not teach what they feel like they like. A Lama teaches what the students need and what they ask for and what they are interested in. Really, basically, what is helpful and meaningful for the students. I mean, there are things that I would love to teach, but it would not be appropriate and should be kept secret.
How do you know, as a teacher, what is appropriate to
because
teach
you're a teacher.
For a given student?
You know because you are a teacher. That's how you know. Otherwise, you wouldn't be a teacher.
Okay.
That's the thing, is that you can't be a teacher without students.
Right. So you say that you know, but in your own mind, what is the kind of diagnosis, the diagnostic process?
You just can see, because you sat in your meditation for decades and you listened to teachings for decades. You had good teachers.
Yeah.
That's how.
Okay.
You combine the teachings, i.e. the language, with the experience, the meditation, and then you know. Now, please don't get me wrong. I'm not claiming to be any great teacher. It's not my point. My point is how it has to go.
Yeah.
And of course, I'm not always skillful at it. I mean, I have to qualify what I'm saying. I'm giving you the doctrine, but I'm not claiming to be a perfect teacher.
Yeah. I understand. Can you talk about the circularity, reincarnation?
Yeah. Reincarnation is based on the idea that this mind that we have, this Buddha nature that we have, it never started. You can't go back and find the beginning of your Buddha nature because it's not a thing that can be located or timed. So if it didn't ever start, well, then it can't ever end. All that happens is it goes from appearance to appearance to appearance. My appearance this time is this Jewish guy from New York, right? That's what I am.
Yeah.
This is how I show up this time. When this particular body gets worn out and passes away, mine just stays.
The mind stays.
Beautifully stays, because it didn't start. it doesn't have anything about it that can stop or even be harmed.
Mm-hmm.
If you get COVID and die, your mind doesn't get COVID and die. It just wakes up in the next rebirth.
Yeah, yeah.
Right? And so that's how it's explained.
You said that you spent several years on meditation retreats.
Yes.
Can you talk about that experience?
Well, I did, I don't know, maybe 10 or more retreats, either, from a week to a year. And then I did one 3.5-year retreat, which is the Tibetan, the traditional Tibetan meditation retreat. It's 3 years, 3 months, 3 days, and 3 hours and 3 seconds.
Oh my gosh.
Something like that.
Wow.
But the point there is that that is the time it would take to become an enlightened Buddha if you did it right. It would take that long to purify and expand.
Where did you go?
I did that in Canada, actually.
Okay.
And that was the longest one, but I did many others, a year here and a year there. I did retreats, many retreats in Colorado, some in Canada, some in upstate New York. And these were how I desire for finding truth. It just goes back to the very first thing I said. I have never changed my intention. And so the retreats are where the meaning is accessible. It's the meaning it's already in you, just needs to be recognized. It needs to be allowed to come out. And the retreats are for that reason, for that purpose. And then you have the authority to speak. Otherwise you don't. My personal feeling is not to insult anyone, but I feel like the minimum requirement to be a teacher and seriously be a teacher in Tibetan Buddhism is at least that 3-year retreat. Then you become a lama. That's why I say I'm a lama, because you're authorized at that point.
What happens in a typical day when you're at one of these retreats?
You hate it.
Okay.
All you want to do is get out of there. And everybody around you, you argue with them. It's not nice. It's not fun. It's very challenging because you can't have the world the way you want it. You don't get that. You have to let go. No matter what you say or do or think, someone else is not going to like it. They're going to argue with you. I mean, just look at what happens in the government. You have to face emptiness and you have to recognize your Buddha nature. And the retreat is set up that you don't have a second to yourself.
Wow.
You don't have a minute to keep anything going. And that's the beauty of it. You can't sit there and start figuring out something and getting onto some trip of some kind and creating your personality and I'm better than them. I mean, the habits are that way. We're all arguing in a way, I mean, it's not really serious, but it's just surface kind of squabbling. But the truth of the matter is that's where you find who you really are. That's where this meaning, this truth that I keep on mentioning, that's how you find it.
You have to pass through that intensity.
You have to finally come to the resolution of what your mind actually is. You have to resolve the mistakes. That's the song. You have to expand the true nature. That's the J. So that's Sanjay. And the way it's done in those 3-year retreats is brilliant. I mean, they figured it out. They hammer it into you. They squeeze you to death in there. And it's awesome. You want to climb over the fence every day.
But at the end,
you know how to practice. And at the end, you can say something. You can speak from some authority. And you know what? You don't say too much. And then someone asks you something meaningful and you can give them a meaningful answer.
Yeah, right. Well, Richard, thank you so much for speaking with me today. I really enjoyed this conversation.
Thank you. Yeah, I did too as well.